Hey there, listeners. Kat here to let you know that right now, Feminist Frequency is in the midst of our spring campaign raising funds to support the Games and Online Harassment Hotline. What have you heard about the hotline? Did you know it's the best tool that we've got for supporting people who play games or work in the games industry and who've experienced abuse, toxicity, or harassment? Through the hotline, we also offer programs like Respect, our accountability support group for people who have caused harm, and the Help Desk, our free consultation service for people in the games industry who want to bring a survivor-centered shift to their organization and create behavior change, repair, and healing. Help us keep offering these essential services for our community and work to transform game culture. Visit the donate page on our website to support the Games and Online Harassment Hotline today. And if you follow us on social media at FemFreak, please share about the campaign and about the Games and Online Harassment Hotline. You could be amplifying this message right into the feed of somebody who really needs to see it. Thanks. This type of macho is going to use this type of machismo against another group.
Like a Pokemon.
Soft boy, I choose you. Welcome to Feminist Frequency Radio presents Machos Fully Loaded. This is the podcast that asks you to be critical of the media you love, and this past season we investigated masculinity in movies and TV. I'm Kat Spada.
Bet you thought you saw The Last of Me, but I'm back. I'm A.C. Lamberty. Also joining us today, Anita Sarkeesian is back for a bonus episode to weigh in on our Macho season.
Monsters.
100% pure adrenaline.
Weapons.
Your move, creep.
Dominance.
Ain't don't hurt.
Machos.
The only place you're gonna go is the hospital.
I will be right back.
And in particular, I'm excited to sidebar about Patrick Swayze. Let's go. Should we just start there?
Yes. Also, I'm so excited to be a guest on my podcast. I'm this is fucking awesome. What's up? I'm a guest. Hey.
You are in the place of honor. I know, sidebar about Swayze. This is Swayze is he
centerpiece.
The arms that hold this whole thing together.
Which I will say, given that you spoke so little about Swayze in the grand scheme of him being the patron saint of this podcast, I will just say that. But, I listened to your trailer and I was like, you're going to talk about Patrick Swayze without me?
Well, you're saving it for today.
For sure.
I mean, it's,
sure.
whatever. You did a great job of it. So, yeah, I'm excited. I love this series. I think it was fucking great. I hope that the listeners really enjoyed it. I think that there's a perspective that you all brought that is obviously different than what I would have brought to the table. There's so many movies and stuff that you talked about that I had never even heard of, or stuff that you included that I knew that I was oh, that's interesting that you're including it. And I think there's something really special about the different ways in which we approach media criticism, especially with a feminist social justice lens. And also it got me really thinking about masculinities, right? So the Daddies episode talking about This Is Us, which fuck that show. The whole time that I was listening to it, I was don't recommend this stupid show. But just that I would not have expected that to be in a series about machos, right? And I think that has something to do with the extent of masculinity. And I think maybe yes, I want to talk about Swayze, but I kind of want to talk about masculinity a little bit if we can start there.
Yeah. Totally. So, and what I wanted to also just to say now that we're looking back at these past 10 episodes is how much even the themes, even the words we were using, there was stuff where, obviously what AC and I considered to be sexual about a character would be different. Or when we looked at what is macho in this particular context, we might have come to it with totally different perspectives. So by no means across the board. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is just a great reminder. Different audiences react to different things and look at things differently. And how do we navigate what is status quo versus what are different audiences and what's the status quo for those audiences, blah, 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 whatever,
So what was your overall thinking about masculinity? Do you think of it as something where you're an audience member to it? You have a perception of it? Or do you think of it as something that you engage with because it's inside all of us? Do you think about it much when not being asked to think about it.
Man, I think about masculinity all the fucking time, all the time. I think that's a really interesting framing of it because like gender identity and the impact of gender on our everyday lives, regardless of how we identify, has such a huge impact on us, right? And how we approach things, how we exist in the world, all of that. And so I like that sort of feminist theory and feminist thought has really evolved to include conversations around masculinity and to make those conversations more complex as well, because there isn't just masculine, feminine. We know this is not the binary. And even within those categories, there's so much more. So I was thinking a lot about hegemonic masculinity while listening to this podcast, which is really old school academic theory. There's a lot of criticisms about the concept of hegemonic masculinity. There's probably been a ton of scholarship since then that has changed and evolved that, but I'm old and have not updated my academic fucking theory understanding since academia. So this is what kind of came to mind. And hegemonic masculinity is a concept developed by Raewyn Connell, who went by R.W. Connell back when she was publishing this work. And it's kind of just a fancy way of just saying men's dominance in society and how men maintain and sustain that dominance. I don't think it's unfair to say we use the word toxic masculinity to describe it today, which is just a more like kind of pop culture way of talking about it. Because there were so many criticisms, there was an expansion of what that means and the different types of masculinities. And so there's things like complicit, marginalized, subordinate, right? The different tiers of the way that masculinity, the way that different types of masculinities are related to hegemonic masculinity. And I think that that's a really interesting way of looking at it. Instead of different orbits, we have, and like, this is still true, we have this peak dominant type idealized masculinity. Again, this is like a little bit messy, but it's considered the sort of peak ideal masculinity that all men should aspire to or be in position with, right? And then what are all the other masculinities that are counter to that are adjacent to that are intersecting with it, right? And that's when you bring in issues of race and issues of sexuality and just like, you talk about soft boys, and I started thinking about like, well, what does it mean to be like kind of a visual representation of a really tough, strong, masculine man, but have all the tenderness and vulnerability with that? Like, where is the space for that? What does that look like, right?
Yeah.
And so I was just thinking about that, right? In and around this whole conversation about what is masculinity like. Also, I'm going on a tangent now, but like there's toxic masculinity, but I think that it's important that we don't demonize masculinity in the same way that I think it's important we don't demonize femininity, which is what happens because of hegemonic masculinity, right? And thinking about it with more complexity and allowing more shape and evolution to notions of what masculinity brings and how it can be a positive thing. I say that with a little bit of like, ugh, but like I think that it's just traits that we have access to as human beings, regardless of our gender identity and what we do with them, how we use it, what they look like, who is able to present in certain ways, I think is interesting and like really kind of special in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I really like what you say kind of about aesthetics, and those were some of my favorite conversations we had too about what a soft boy looks like, even kind of the aesthetic conversations in lady machos or alpha machos or whatever. And it's so interesting like listening to you talk about like, maybe somebody who looks like an alpha macho but is rejecting like the values of hegemonic masculinity. That's so interesting to me. Like it's so crazy that none of us seem to enjoy traditional gender roles. Like even the straightest, most cis dudes I know, like nobody is ever an exact example of like traditional hegemonic cis het white, gender values basically.
It's like
but
clothing.
Yet there's like a joy to it in some ways too. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like that's in experiencing like my transition in some ways. It's like, of course I love aspects of hegemonic masculinity that I'm like presenting physically.
Mm-hmm.
Do I agree with these values? No, I don't. But like,
it's
there's still,
seductive.
like you said, like where's the space for that? Yeah, it's really interesting.
It's extremely seductive. And I think that media is extremely dangerous in the way that it allows us to be seduced by it. And like, I say dangerous, but that's not the right word. I think that we do need to be careful about what our fantasies are and what we are attracted to and like why we're attracted to them and what social cues have taught us to be attracted to. But like, yeah, like I fucking watch Fast and the Furious too, you know, and John Wick as well. And like, I can enjoy aspects of it, but I also sometimes feel a little bit gross about it, you know? And I think it's okay to live in this sort of awkward space around it with the knowledge and education. I was saying that, it's like clothes. Like nobody wants to be put into a category in this way. That's an unself-imposed category, right? And like clothes aren't made for any real body. Like I'm so short and I'm always like nothing fits me. But like I talk to anybody and they're like, yeah, the clothes don't fit me. My torso's too tall, or I'm too tall, or I'm fat and clothes aren't made for me, or whatever, right? And I think it's the same thing of like, we have these ideals and these impressions that are not based in actual humans because we are more complex than that.
This is such a bonkers connection, but in thinking about like the different variations of masculinities and how they can like work together or support each other, support like oppressive systems, and then also how they can be used against each other. Like, well, this type of macho is going to like use this type of machismo against another group.
Like a Pokemon.
Soft boy, I choose you. There is this guy on Twitter who I don't know if he's a tailor or if he's like a fashion historian or what, but he does these Twitter threads where he will talk about like how men's tailoring is done poorly. And he always uses examples of like conservative politicians. Like he'll show a picture of like some guy who uses his platform to like bring down women and people of color and LGBT people. And he'll never say like, this guy fucking sucks because of his values, but he'll say, here's an example of why these pants are cut wrong. They are
I love that. That's awesome.
They're cut for someone who labors and might have a better musculature, but this particular individual does not. And thus, like, they fall incorrectly and they should have used like the bias cut or whatever. And it's so interesting because this guy has access to like a class privilege in knowing like what all of this history is. He's using like it. Typically, I would say like, this is ableist, right? Like you shouldn't say like someone looks bad because they like look quote unquote weak, right? But he's just using like his particular masculine skill set to say like, and this guy fucking sucks. And you can tell because he's wearing the wrong cut of pant with this shoe. And also look him up. He's terrible.
It's so crazy though, because I feel like there's also an audience that would be like, well, what are you talking? Like, okay, gay. You like clothes. Like, okay, gay. It doesn't matter. Like, you're like, which is it's so fascinating. Like, it really is just all the masculinities.
I'll find one of those threads to link in the show notes.
Nice.
Oh, interesting.
So I want to talk about Swayze before we like wait till the very end of the episode because I'm like, there's like so many tangents we can go on from here. But like,
I sent Kat a voice note just to kick things off. I sent her a voice note last week where I was like, knowing that there was a time when Patrick Swayze played Billy Flynn in Chicago, like I have not gotten a full 8 hours since. Like I want to see that. Like it's crazy. Anyway,
we'll find it.
Go off.
So I don't know all of Swayze's discography by any means. I am obsessed with my Swayze trifecta, which is Dirty Dancing, Point Break, and Roadhouse.
Holy Trinity.
That's Trinity. It. That's all I care about with the Swayze.
Yeah. Tag yourself.
Yeah. Ghost is a trash movie that is so bad. It's so fucking terrible. But here's the thing is, so my history around this is I grew up watching a lot of dance movies because my mom loved dance movies. And I watched Dirty Dancing when I was like 5 for the first time. Like, it's just always been around. As an adult, I watch it like 5 times a year. I'm fucking obsessed with Dirty Dancing. Before it was cool to be obsessed with Dirty Dancing, like I used to not want to tell people. And then I watched it like as an aware adult, and was like, this is actually like kind of progressive. Like, there's a lot of progressive shit in this. And so I started to like really own it and be like, no, you need to go back and watch this fucking movie because it's actually great. And there's all of these like social justice dance movies that are like about class or race, and they're like kind of superficial or whatever. But I think there's something interesting about dance movies being a vehicle for these kinds of stories. So, you know, Swayze was clearly a formative part of my sexual identity growing up. I mean, his arms, like his arms, just, I don't know what else to say, but
alternative thesis to The Outsiders.
But
in episode 1.
I think like, because these movies are such comfort movies for me. I don't want to do what I'm about to do. But I will, because you be critical of the media you love, right?
Right.
He doesn't play like good people, you know, like he's kind of a dick. And if you like read about the history of making Dirty Dancing, like him and Jennifer Grey did not get along. There are scenes in that movie that are supposed to be like, you know, like the scene where they're doing the little dance number in the montage, and he's like tickling her and he's getting mad and she's like can't keep a straight face. Like, that was real. That wasn't the movie, right? And they just kept it in because it worked. So like he's a fucking macho, you know? I think the allure of Swayze is also part of the problem in that I'm trying to talk about here, where it's like, there is this fantasy that I think girls are raised with in terms of the heteronormative relationship. And I think he is the perfect like epitome of this fantasy, which is the guy that will hold you and make you feel safe because he's a little bit bigger than you and he's tough and he's like a little bit mean, but not to you. He's vulnerable with you because men can be vulnerable a little bit, because we have such low standards for male vulnerability in the private confines of a hetero relationship. And that, I think, Swayze epitomizes to a T, right? You can fall into this fantasy of, I'm the pick-me girl, I'm special, this guy who is not nice to other people is nice to me. And he, like, you know, is really sad about all of these rich women taking advantage of his body, you know? So this like tough yet vulnerable space that he lives in, I think is really like kind of a problem, but also extremely fucking hot. Like, I don't know what to say about it. And like, we are so I think that we are taught, and for good reason though, is to be attracted to some of that vulnerability. And I think Patrick Swayze as an actor has that. He really has that. Like Bodhi in Point Break is such a fucking incredible character that I don't think a lot of actors could possibly have pulled off.
No.
The nuance of this person and like the ups and downs and the like the complexity of, you know, and like he's magnetic on film.
Oh, so true.
I think that the class part is also really entwined with this. And like we talked a little bit about it here and there, but it's entwined, like, just, you know, we struggled, I think, in this season with having like a really robust attention to non-white characters, because a lot of what we were talking about was like mainstream Hollywood cinema and like what is presented to us as the most desirable. And with Class, like, I almost wonder, like, is there a white collar macho? Because a lot of, I think, what we have tied into like the danger of these men is linked to that. Is the like, last week I'm eating jujubes to get by, this week they're putting diamonds in my pocket. Or the fact that like even in Roadhouse, like he's a working class guy and then she's a doctor, right? Like the love interest. There's that sense of dabbling in this blue collar masculinity.
Yeah, and it's the reverse of Pretty Woman. It's the like
Yeah.
gender reverse of Pretty Woman in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and I think that says a lot to also like what, you know, it's creepy to say that like if you're working class or blue collar that you're dangerous. That's really gross and harmful and dangerous and like has ruined a lot of lives, right? But it is definitely something that like I agree. I was raised with the same kind of like sexual discovery of like this is sexy, this like character that, you know, why we did all of this is we were having conversations of like even when we are intellectually opposed to the masculinities or the like gender presentations that we're being shown, we're aroused by them or we're drawn to them or we're just at the very least fascinated by them. Like even when it's, you know, when I was talking about Tom of Finland, I was like, this isn't for me. This is not, I am not the intended audience for this, but I'm like the, you know, Clockwork Orange. I can't close my eyes. I want to like take in as much of this machismo because it feels in some ways so different to my personal lived experience. We talked a bit about, and this was a really interesting thing for me, AC, your perspective on like representation politics, especially in terms of queer portrayals and, you know, when do we accept it and when don't we accept it? But we touched on like straights playing queers. And Anita, I know you had some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I was thinking about it because in the episode, you both were like, fuck this conversation about whether straights can play queers, right? And I was like, well,
sounds right.
You know, I don't know if I'm that dismissive of this. I did a series called That Time When, and we talked about Ellen and how important her coming out was in the history of media representation. And there's a whole section of that episode that got cut. That didn't make it because it was just whatever. And in that, I talked about like this issue a little bit of how like I think it's still important. So let me go back a little bit. You talk about Brokeback Mountain a lot. Groundbreaking film, frustratingly groundbreaking. It's straight people taking a trip down queer lane, you know, and like regardless of whether the film is great or not, like that's still what's happening. And so you get these and Kat, I also like everyone's fucking gay, right? Everyone's a little bit gay. I'm just like I fully agree with that. So I'm gonna just put that aside for the point of this of like sort of dominant culture conversation, but like. These people in the films that were made in the 90s and 2000s before we got more mainstream queer representation, they're celebrated for their bravery of playing a queer person and showing queer stories, and it makes me want to vomit. Like, fuck you. You know, like that you took a risk in your career to pretend to be gay. Like it's incredibly patronizing and gross to me. And you know, I think that this is changing. I think more queer folks are able to tell their own stories. I think we are getting better representation and more nuanced representation of queer folks. But like, it's not, you know, you look at Dallas Buyers Club and Jared Leto playing a trans woman, and like, it's not just that Jared Leto, a cis white dude, played a trans woman. It's that he was a fucking piece of shit about it on top of the fact that he shouldn't have played it. Like when he won the Oscar for it, he talked about not the like challenges of being trans and how we should be more supportive of trans folks as cis people, but that he had to wax his whole body, and how hard was that for him? So I did want to just drop that in here of being like, there's still a lot of this shit that's like orbiting Hollywood and media cinema in general. And while I want us to absolutely recognize the growth and change in the media landscape, like it's not, we're still teetering on the people who get to make the decisions about what are the acceptable queer stories and who are the acceptable queers to be able to tell them, is still aggressively gate kept, you know?
Yeah. For some reason, I don't know if I'm able to like articulate this in a way that's like coherent, but for some reason, I feel different about trans actors playing trans characters than I do about cis queer people playing cis queer roles. I don't know if they're
Like
just
cis straight people playing cis
yeah,
queer roles.
yes. Yeah. I don't know if there's like, I don't know, people have thought about this before, but there's just something different to me about that I'm not sure if I can speak. I mean, I don't know, but I also feel really more precious about like the identities of writers and directors these days. Like Bros in particular, having a straight director was a very upsetting viewing experience for me. Like that was a tough movie for me to watch because it was clearly so like for an audience that it shouldn't have been for. Do you know what I mean? Like, so I don't know. I feel a lot more precious about, the identities of like directors and writers helming like weird trans stories.
When I started doing this work, the mainstream conversation was about representation, like who is on camera and how are they represented on camera. I think that conversation has rightfully and appropriately evolved. And I say this in that these conversations were always happening, just some become more mainstream than others at different times. That conversation has evolved to be who is making the media, who is behind the scenes in the media. And I think that is part of this, right? Is part of the like, cool, we push forward and we push progress forward a little bit and then we demand more because it's not done yet, you know? And I think that's valuable. And I think part of the trans stuff is, this is not like an answer or even a hypothesis around that point, but I think that there's something about the fact that like trans visibility is so much higher right now than it was in the past. Whereas I would argue that just having like gay men represented on camera was as big of a deal in the 90s as trans representation is now. But it's hard. It's so hard to understand that if you didn't live through it, right? Right. And so when we go back and look at like movies from the 50s and 60s, you're like, I can intellectually understand that society was different, but like I lived through this and I saw this transformation happen, and so it hits a little different. I think I was like, when I was a young queer, like we had the internet, but it wasn't like social media internet, and like you had like the lesbian bookstore in the town a few towns over, and that was kind of the only thing, and maybe one queer bar, but I was underage, so they were hard to sneak into. So like it just the access is very different, and the representation and the seeing more identities represented to people who didn't have access to that, I think is huge and different. And so we're demanding more, right? We're demanding more from our filmmakers.
One thing I observe when we talk about who like straight actors playing queer roles is that I do think it's very different based on men and women. And like, I wonder if that's partially because like in our current society, we accept that like, or we seem to accept a thing that may or may not be true, which is like women having more fluidity of like sexuality and men being like there, I think there is a concept of like, there's no such thing as a 100% heterosexual woman. Whereas like, we definitely accept there are 100% heterosexual men. And I wonder if that's part of the reason why, like, I do think that the queer community like welcomes our Rachel Weisz's and our Cate Blanchetts and like these women who regularly play queer roles, but as far as we know, don't have any personal queer identity. But with men, I think it seems like a lot more stark, because if you take this big risk and play a gay character, then it's like, well, we're always going to wonder about Jake Gyllenhaal. Like, surely he's, bisexual, as if that even exists. JK, obviously. But like, I do think that that's something that's very gendered, because I don't know if it's just because like men need to be marketable in a certain way that's different from how women need to be. Like, I think Kristen Stewart is a really interesting example of like an openly queer woman who can play different roles, but like, I don't know, like I think of the Rachel Weisz Kate Blanchett thing is like, she's like a pet of the queer community. Like, oh, and we have her, like, kind of. Like, she's Carol. So, end of discussion. I don't know.
And why is that okay or better? I think this transitions really nicely into Lady Machos and also comes back to hegemonic masculinity, right? So if our dominant, if the dominant way of being is this sort of hyper masculine, stoic, emotionless, violent, or willing to use violence, is what we think of as heroes, right? What we think of as machos in a lot of ways. That the lady macho is women are allowed to assume the role of masculine, but men are not allowed to assume the role of feminine because feminine is at the bottom of the fucking pyramid, right? Women are the insult if you are not being man enough, quote unquote, right?
Right.
And so Lady Machos, I think, is really interesting. And I thought your ways that you approached that was so different than how I would have talked about it, which I was fascinated by and really appreciated. So in grad school, I wrote a thesis on strong, quote unquote, strong female characters and patriarchy and how that plays out. And it's interesting to me, that was, God, I don't know, 15, fucking more than 20 years ago, something. We don't use the word strong female characters anymore. And I think that that's great because it means that we have moved on from this fucking trope that is, or this archetype in some ways. But when I think of Lady Machos, I think of that, right? And I think of the work that I did around that, which literally I charted out all of the traits that we identify as masculine traits versus feminine traits, and all of the characters that most of us fucking loved and found empowering and exciting and interesting that were female, strong female characters, all had these hyper masculine traits. And they did not have any of the traits that we associate with femininity, right? Independent, stoic, violent, and they also have to be hot, right? So the aesthetics are really important here. That's like a huge part of it. But for the most part, I do think it's interesting to take a step back and look at like what are the traits and who's allowed to have them and who gets celebrated for having what. So having a compassionate man is not acceptable in the fucking rules of whatever, right? Which is why a Swayze who has a bit of vulnerability, but not too much to make him too girly, is acceptable and still appealing, right?
For sure.
So I think that there's something interesting about that. I do think that the idea of the strong female character and who we think of as lady machos has evolved in ways that I am pleased with. I think that a lot of characters have evolved, though. I don't think it was specifically about that. I think that we are kind of expecting more from our media in terms of like the depth of characters. Sometimes it's really superficial, like Disney's obsession with fucking trauma and grief to make all their shit seem deep, but not like really dealing with it, but like that kind of stuff, right?
Totally.
But here I do have to shout out Emily Blunt. I was so pleased you talked about Edge of Tomorrow. Emily Blunt, I think, is one of the best quote unquote strong female character actors because she has a level of vulnerability that she brings to those roles when she's playing those roles that I think is unparalleled in a lot of female actors in those roles. Like she is still kind of tough and does her shit, but she's not like lost in the sort of heroic, like the stereotypical heroicism of it. She delights me every time. Even if like in something like Sicario, where she plays this type of role, I think they treat her like shit as a character and they really fuck her over. Even in that, I still am like, she brought so much to the table and so much depth to the table in that regard that made her feel believable and full, you know?
I think that the definition of strong is something that has really grown in the last 20 years since your thesis. Like, and that I think was honestly like one of my early awakenings to like a certain type of understanding of feminism, actually, like which was, I really thought, oh well, strong, physically strong, like big men, physically strong, and there are some women who are that also, and how like having to kind of reckon with what that meant to me in my like late teens probably, and that was a long process, is something that made as characters just got richer, just made an understanding of that even better. Like that there are characters who are emotionally strong. There are characters who like you can be strong and that doesn't mean that you're resilient all the time and you never cry or whatever. Like that strength is something we've always ascribed to men because they are the best, they are better. And I think that that's something that like it just shows up in so many areas of our society. Like, yeah, of course women can wear pants, but like if a man wears a skirt, that's a big deal. Now women can join the workforce, but men don't have to lower themselves to like take care of the, kin keeping and household responsibilities because that's women's work. So I'm hopeful that, I think that's why, sorry, not hopeful. I'm not hopeful about anything. I think it's important to say like why we're talking about masculinity and why we're not talking about it because it sucks. We're talking about it because like the patriarchy is harmful to everyone. And that by uplifting, like we can uplift femininity and we can also talk about masculinity like in a way that is complete to some extent.
I think also for me, the goal is to recognize that all humans, regardless of any identity, or let's just stick with gender, but have all like the full range of traits that all humans have available to them, right? With some caveats. But yeah. So the goal for me is to disattach that from gender, right? That like anyone of any gender can be an aggressive piece of shit, and anyone of any gender can be vulnerable and compassionate and caring. And that as a society, we redesignate what we value, right? That some traits we will value more than other traits, and that our media can then reflect those traits to help promote those values, right? That's why I care so much about media, is I think the media is one of the big pillars that teaches us what to value, right? So if we all of a sudden have a media that overwhelmingly supports or at the end of the day says compassion and empathy and care is paramount and that's what we should strive for, that would transform the way that we engage as a society. And that's not to say that characters need to be fucking perfect. That's just to say that like the struggle of it is like in the Daddies episode, you talk about the difference between Mrs. Doubtfire and School of Rock and how one of them is like a personal transformation and growth outside of the box that he thought he was in versus I just got what I wanted at the end of the day. I didn't change. I didn't grow. I didn't develop. I just got the thing. Yeah. And I think that that's a big difference in when we talk about character development and talking about the values that we want to promote,
Yeah.
Okay, so feel free. We can jump back if you have a hard no to this, but like, is this the moment where we talk about Ted Lasso? Which,
Wait, do you have a history with Ted Lasso? I have feelings and thoughts, but I'm excited to hear.
Yeah. Okay. I did put it in here. I did make it in my notes. So my very brief history is I was so fucking obsessed with season 1 of Ted Lasso that I watched it 6 times. I threw a fucking season 2 watch party that was lovely. Kat came to it. It was amazing.
Oh, that's sweet.
I did a TED talk about Ted Lasso's masculinity.
Whoa.
I was like, this show is groundbreaking.
Cracked the code.
And then it lost it. It lost it so hard. So hard that I couldn't I was so devastated that I couldn't talk about it. People would bring it up around me and I was like, I just I don't know what happened. I became so emotional that I couldn't even address it. That's why Kat's kind of I don't know, can we? So whatever, this is not going to be the Ted Lasso podcast. I'm not, whatever, season 3, whatever.
Also, that is my take as well. Yeah. Season 1, great, so fun. I didn't think a lot about the masculinity aspect of it, so would love to hear that, but totally agree.
I'll send you my TED talk.
Such a crazy way. Please. Yeah, I love that.
I think I was thinking about Ted when you were talking about daddy machos, and because and when you talk about masculinity, it's so hard not to think of Ted Lasso because it is entirely about, or at least the first season is entirely about all these different types of masculinity and the growth and evolution of those, right?
Yeah.
And so when we talk about bodies versus personalities, like Ted is this like fucking Southern dude with a mustache that's like into sports or whatever, and is just like really kind and compassionate and caring. And he's not only a dad, he's a dad to the whole fucking team, right?
Yeah.
And the growth and evolution of that. And you look at someone like Jamie, who's just such a fucking playboy and piece of shit and not willing to like listen to anyone or hear anyone outside of his own orbit. And Roy being like, I was like you, now fucking listen to me, and going the complete opposite of Ted in that way and not getting anywhere, right? But eventually, right? And so I think that there's some really interesting vulnerability, growth and exploration of different types of masculinity in the show. And that's changed over time, whatever. We don't have to go through all of that. But
I'm afraid I am going to have to weigh in on season 3, but I'll hold for a moment.
Yeah, no, I'm done.
I haven't watched a single frame.
The reason I brought it up is what you just said about like characters don't have to be perfect, but we can value like compassion and care and several things like across the board, from athletes to mothers to dorks or whatever. And I think that that's what is so devastating about how bad the show's writing has gotten, is that the show what we all of us were impressed by in season 1 is that it presented a utopian version of these types of men, like men who can grow and men who can talk and men who want to grow and who want to talk. And what they've done 2 things in this 3rd season that I think have just been so cheap, which is like striving to make all of these decisions perfect. And I think that is just so lazy. And there's this redemption arc for Nate, who cares? But like this main thing is there's an episode in season 3 where one of the players is outed as being gay, and one of his teammates is like really surly about it for 2/3 of the episode. And you don't really know how he's going to react or what he's finally going to say when he confronts his gay teammate. And I thought, I will be so impressed if this character is homophobic. I will be so impressed if they show that this character, like a lot of people, is homophobic, and that's
in sports too. Like there's specifically in sports, they're like missing opportunities to like tackle that world. Oh my god. Okay,
so
continue.
They set up like, of course, the gay character is afraid because of homophobia, but why this one guy is really upset about it. And I thought, this is going to be a really interesting, brave choice for this show to have a character say, I just can't fucking get my mind around it, bro. Like, I'm going to have to really figure out how I feel about you from here on out. I was like, this is going to be interesting. Instead, I was like 20 minutes before he said the line came through my head, is like, he's going to fucking say, why couldn't you trust me? Why did you have to keep it a secret from me? And that's exactly what the tension was. And I was like, that's not, I appreciate that. Give us something to aspire to. Give us a character like Ted and characters like Roy in season 1 that we can aspire to see these types of men in our world. But to completely neuter reality in that way, I think is so, it just doesn't earn any of the like fuzzy feeling that you're supposed to have. It's like, oh, cool, great. So in football clubs around the world, there's no such thing as homophobia. Glad to hear it. Like,
neutered is a really good word.
Yeah.
Very good. Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. I just can't. I have so many thoughts. I just can't. Fucking the show. Whatever.
Send it off. Send it off.
It's so
on a
hard.
nice flow.
It's so hard. Yeah. I think the dads.
Funeral for a friend.
I think there's something interesting about dads here when you think about like what happens to actors when they get older, right? And like women become moms and old dudes become dads, or they become fucking superheroes who have to save their daughters, whatever. So I was thinking, I kept thinking about Arnold Schwarzenegger in Kindergarten Cop. And how film, one of the ways that film tells stories is to use contrast, right? Whether it is like in set design, color, character, story. And so the humor and the comedy of it is that you have the big tough guy trying to be parental and like there's something kind of gross about that, you know, like that's funny, that it's funny that someone that looks like that could be soft and tender. And he's not,
Right.
you know, like that's not what they're doing here. But like the contrast of bodies and personality as a narrative play, I think is could be done very well, but it's not what's happening here. But then you look at someone like Sylvester Stallone in Creed, right? He goes from being fucking Rocky, talk about alpha macho, to a dad. Well, he's actually a dad, but like he's an uncle, but he like this fatherly figure and the tension around that. And like, I think that is done a little bit better than in some other ways, but it's still this like, what, you know, like how do you be when you are an old macho? What does that look like for you, you know?
Well, if I may contradict you there, I'm going to go ahead and say Rocky's a beta macho. Because imagine my surprise when I finally watched that movie and he loses at the end. And like he's got the little goldfish and he, you know, goes ice skating with Adrian. Like he's not necessarily Arnold in Kindergarten Cop. And
which is interesting. So then there's another thing about the actors who play these roles and then who they are in real life. So two examples right now that come to mind is I don't know this whole history, but he's a fucking writer and he like helmed Rocky and like made that happen and like has worked on other scripts and like is, you know, like you think of him as this dumb meathead, but he's like, he's a filmmaker. And I was thinking about this because I just watched the first episode of the Brooke Shields documentary, Pretty Baby. And at the end of the first episode, they talk about how she goes to college and how everybody was like, oh my God, she's smart. Right? Because she's been sexualized since she was a child. And there's something also, you know, we're talking about representation, but there's also something about our impressions that we put on these people and who they are and how they become these symbols to represent a very narrow ideal of that whatever we want them to be we decide them to be as a society, you know? And like, I get that on a much smaller level, right? Like I am a symbol to a lot of people that has nothing to do with who I am and my personality. I'm just like either this monster that ruined video games or this person who like helmed the way for women in gaming. And neither of those is me, you know?
Right.
So like imagine on a global scale being attached to this symbol that like you can't break out of. And I think that's also really harmful, you know?
AC, we talked a little bit about to the point of like what happens to machos as they age. And I really haven't cracked the nut of like Tom Cruise and Keanu Reeves being roughly the same age.
Yeah, you all called that out, I was like, holy fuck. I don't know why that feels weird, but it feels weird, right?
It feels weird, and they both have this kind of like, I don't know, transcendent ability that is like a little scary to behold. I don't know, but it really seems like they kind of, I don't know, escape having to play dads.
Right.
Basically.
All I can think of with Tom Cruise.
And there is the physicality there too, I think.
He's got the War of the Worlds.
Yeah.
And like, that's like a daddy saves his daughter from the alien invasion, I guess. But like, I was like, I can't. What's interesting about all of these too is like what is fatherhood is like protecting them from danger or keeping them in line because children are little, you know, rascals. What we aren't seeing a lot of, except in freaking Dewey Finn in School of Rock.
I'm like, is School of Rock kind of like the perfect text? But go on.
Is nurturing.
Yeah.
That's not like what we're seeing in fatherhood. That's from others.
Totally.
But like actually not just keeping them in line or protecting them from danger, but actually being like, I am here to help you grow as little people with hearts, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. And the sort of soft boys, like, I don't know what to say. I had the whole time I was listening to that episode, I had this feeling that I can't quite articulate about my frustration with soft boys.
That's how I felt too.
like,
it's so weird.
And it goes back to this, like, I'm gonna keep coming back to this, like, we assign certain human traits a gender. And with soft boys, it's like they have to look a certain way, they have to act a certain way, and then they're queer coded.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And that's it. Or they can only get certain roles or whatever.
A lot to ask of a boy.
Yeah. And you look at, people can change out of that. I think that men have more ability to transform their public persona.
Yeah.
So you look at someone like Leonardo DiCaprio, who is absolutely a fucking like soft boy, teen boy, fully. And he is not
Totally.
as an adult. Like he's like grown way the fuck out of that, But I think there's something.
The evolution of the pussy posse could be its own its own limited series.
An investigative report.
But I think that why am I more frustrated that soft boys get categorized into the category that they're in than I do about alphas getting categorized into the category they're in? And I think it has to do with the closeness to femininity, quote unquote, and my personal frustration with patriarchy being like femininity is bad, versus like alphas, it's easier to be like, well, you're the problem.
Clarifying question. Is it a frustration for both of you? Because I almost suspect that you have a different answer to this. Is it a frustration with these characters because of how, like, I'm frustrated on their behalf that they've been pigeonholed in this way? Or is it like, I'm frustrated by these characters because they get to have all the benefits of being men without the like hardships of being women, but respected in a certain way? Like, I feel like those could be two different directions for frustration.
Yeah, actually, I don't know if my frustration is either. I think it might fall closer to the latter, but like, it is so. I find the soft boy category so specific about appearance in a way that there is like less fluidity there, to the point where I'm like, well, this becomes exclusionary in a way that I like. Where is there space for like a soft boy, like your notes here, Anita, like fat or larger bodied people, disabled people, people of color, trans guys who are like kind of inherently infantilized, especially by certain like parts of the queer community. Like it just seems so, I don't know, it activates me in a personal way too, or it's just like messy and kind of annoying that it feels particularly exclusionary to all kinds of men. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. I kept thinking of Tom Holland.
Yeah.
I would say Tom Holland's also patron saint of this kind of podcast in some way. That you brought up the lip sync, the
Umbrella.
Singing in the Rain, Umbrella lip sync, which is like one of the best things that's ever been made. And there's something to me about Tom Holland that like he can play, like, I don't give a fuck about Spider-Man. I will always watch the Spider-Man movies because I think there's something so magnetic about how he plays that role. And I just find him so captivating because he's definitely soft boy, but like teetering on the brink a little bit, you know?
Because he's also a macho who dances.
Yeah.
He was a Billy Elliot before he was Spider-Man.
Yeah, like extremely talented, but there's something very engaging about him. But yeah, there's something, you're right. It is very it is so tied to visuals, right? And like how, like, can we I don't know. I wrote positive masculinity, positive femininity. I don't fucking know what that note was. It was like after I listened to the episode. But I'm thinking about that, like, how do we like separate out our ideals around like, is this good or bad, right? And make that a little more complicated. But also like I would put like Jared Leto and fucking Claire Danes from,
My
like
So-Called Life,
yeah, like I was thinking about him with Teen Machos and I don't know where I'm going. Sorry, I feel so like unprepared, but something about soft boys I find really hard to like nail down and like grapple with, and it's frustrating to me.
Yeah.
There is one human individual that we never talked about on this series that it's occurring to me in this episode, like how much he's relevant to every one of these conversations, and that is.
Wait, can I guess?
Please.
Okay.
Tom
Let me look at our
Hiddleston.
episodes.
No.
Ooh, that's a good guess. I was going to say Timothy Chalamet, but he is definitely not all.
No. This
Jonathan Taylor Thomas.
I was thinking about him
He
too.
was a cartoon.
stop you there. It is 6'5" individual Lee Pace.
Lee Pace.
Oh,
Because
Dad.
he played a trans woman in Soldier's Girl.
Oh, did he? I didn't
Oh, I
know
forgot
that.
about that.
He was he's been cagey to closeted about his sexuality for like a lot of his earlier years of his career. Ultimate soft boy in Pushing Daisies, in a way that like the fact that he could not make physical contact with his love interest like led to both like a heightened sexuality, I think, for me as a viewer. But
Yearning.
the yearning. But also like he was so
alpha in Halt and Catch Fire.
Alpha in Halt and Catch Fire, but also like wasn't he a chaotic bisexual? He has played like a Marvel villain, and then like in recent years he's like an Insta thought, and just like posting feet pics and like
he was literally just like kind of just like a hot, sexy guy in Bodies last year. Like he was on set for 2 days and called
Also,
it.
I know we are not allowed to speak of this horrible show, but The Foundation.
I was thinking about that. Like I watched like 2 episodes of it, but he plays this like alpha being, right? Like he's supposed to be the best specimen or whatever on this planet or space station.
Yeah.
I don't know.
But, I keep thinking about race in relation to this, like Ebony's comment, and just the fact that like most of these characters are not are not men of color, and like, what about someone like Stephen Yeun? Like, where does he fall into some of this? I was thinking of Moonlight as well.
Yes.
The like sort of really sort of tough boy character that is like, I have to be this way, but I'm queer and I'm closeted and all this stuff. Like the different, that's a part of the like marginalized masculinities, right? What does it mean to be adjacent to these roles? Or what about like if you are like a physically large Black man, you are 100% typecast into like the alpha role. But like, are you the sidekick alpha, or do you get to be your own alpha? If there's like a not Nick Cage, what's Luke Cage?
Colton.
I'm totally blanking on his name.
Yeah.
That like and also
Coulter.
the lightning one. There's like I watched a few seasons of that. Like what? Yeah, and what does that masculinity look like? Do they get to be as complex as these characters? Not saying that all these characters are complex. Like what is the limitations that are imposed on them, and what can they be? Do they get to be the love interest? Like Idris Elba, like has he sort of transcended in some ways the constraints around attractiveness or like desirability? The Rock is also, which you talked about, a quintessential example of the like, well, he can be whoever the audience wants him to be, and that's why he's so palatable, and like the problems with that, right? The ethnically, quote unquote, ethnically ambiguous characters are people who can be whoever the audience wants them to be,
Moonlight is such a wonderful capsule of a lot of different types of masculinities. You think obviously Mahershala Ali like gets a lot of attention for that father figure that he plays and how complicated that role is, and that we get to see masculinity like used as armor for this character and for the main character. And like I was thinking about that one when going into the Machos Who Love Machos episode. And I think what I wasn't prepared to talk about was how much like that main character shied away from sexuality and was afraid of it because of his own self-preservation. But like, yeah, if anybody has listened to this and hasn't watched Moonlight, please rectify that.
Michael B. Jordan, I think, is a really interesting example too, that I think is in many of these categories, and that like has been allowed space too, in terms of what masculinity, like a more variety of masculinity, but still like Black man in Hollywood, like there's still so many limitations there. So I don't. So this is another one that I'm like, I don't have like fully formed thoughts about this, but at some point I wrote a note listening to the season writing what makes a sexy movie. And I was like, what did I mean by that? And I was thinking about how like, I was thinking about this recently too, about like what films are sexy, how subjective is that versus not subjective, and how much like, you're talking about how like the Marvel movies are just sexless. Like they're not horny in any way whatsoever. And there's something, I'm sure there's lots written about this somewhere, but there's something about the mainstreaming of bodies and sexuality and this very specific type of sexuality becoming more accessible both in music and film and what have you, porn being extremely accessible, that like it's just not as exciting anymore, and like there's not as many creative ways that sexuality is shown. And like the first movie that came to mind when I was thinking about like a sexy movie was Portrait of a Lady on Fire. Where you're just like there, and that's like extremely sensual and like sweet and caring and whatever. And like, it's not like that's, whatever. I also rewatched The Secretary recently, which would also probably be in a category, but I also like was really frustrated and kind of pissed off with that movie and its representation of BDSM. Because apparently all BDSM in mainstream-ish films is all people who have trauma. So you could only you're only kinky sexually if you're doing it because you're deeply traumatized. And I'm like, you all go fuck yourselves, And
it's like all 24/7, like completely.
It's all lifestyle. And you're just like, that's not. Can we have more kink representation, please, in our media? But
we'll say James Spader, Macho who fucks a lot.
Yeah. While we have more sexual representation, there is a little more sexual liberation. It's kind of all the same shit, right? Like it is still fairly like the same types of representation. And you had brought this up of like these 80s movies with all these fucking machos were so subtextually like homoerotic. Like in just like the friendship, like Top Gun and fucking Point Break, and like they just were oozing this like
throbbing veiny arms in Predator.
There was something to it, and we've like lost that. Like things have been kind of sanitized as they've become more explicit, and I don't know. There's something. I'm sure I have no doubt that many an article has been written about this.
I don't know if this makes sense, but I'm going to say it anyway. When I think of Point Break and Top Gun and like the kind of homoerotic subtext and stuff, for me, when I see those movies, I'm like, these men are obsessed with each other as men. Like they are obsessed with one another's expressions of masculinity. Like they want to embody kind of the same modes of masculinity or really are attracted to that about one another, which I love about those movies. I think that's like the most interesting part, like how each man takes an interest in masculinity, both for themselves and for like the other men that they're interacting with. I certainly think that's the case in Point Break. That's crazy.
Well, I think this opens up to a very valid criticism Anita has of our discussion of the Fast and Furious franchise, which is obsession. Like, can a man be obsessed with another man and it not be homoerotic? I think is a question that I do not have the answer to. Because like my experience with all of these men is like somehow personally homoerotic, like, like somehow in my viewing of like The Rock or Jason Statham, like I am also a man watching it, and
it's big lesbians obsessed with gay porn energy,
Yeah, there's this like something.
That's a thing if y'all didn't know that.
But in these movies, like it really, there's so much like, I don't think in these movies they ever say like you're a pussy, but they're like saying it in a way where it's all they think about is like, is my dick bigger than yours? And I think that what we didn't talk about, Anita, I want to give you some time, which is to like how like hateful all of that language really is.
Yeah, like I've watched all of Fast and Furious. I watched some of the movies a few times. I watched them in chronological order to the canon, not to the release dates. And I like cars and I like racing. Like it's hard not to get sucked into this. What would Fast and the Furious look like if it was made with the same kind of energy as a Top Gun or a Point Break? Right? It's just it's not that. And you have like.
So
you have
true.
like Vin Diesel and The Rock like standing there with their arms, like they have to walk with their arms like outside their bodies because their muscles are too big. And then they're like aligned next to each other, like trying to walk through doorways and shit, And it's funny and it's goofy. And like, I struggle with talking about Fast and Furious because it is the racial component of Fast and the Furious is so important.
Yeah.
That it is this huge franchise full of people of color is so key and so important. But it is also all of the shit. Like it's all, like if I were to really do a deep dive into this series and do like a fucking textual feminist analysis, I'd be like, this is trash for us. Like this is not good, right?
It's like melting pot vibes. Like it's not.
Yeah.
Like I get it, but it's not good per se. Like the analogy's off. You know what I mean?
And I think it is not trying to make a commentary on race. It's just racialized bodies that exist. It's not trying to make any social commentary at all. It's supposed to, I mean, they go to fucking space, like it is just, it is an absurd, ridiculous, like you talked about the like punching the fucking vault thing with your bare hand, like, come on, the save or whatever. And there's something fun and goofy about that. Right. But there is, the Ludacris and Tyrese who are, like they're the oh my god, what's the word?
They're comedic relief.
Comedic relief, and their comedic relief is very sexualized, right?
Yeah.
It's all about like I'm a man and I like pussy, did you know that? And there's a racial element to that in the way that they talk about it, right? In the way that they behave, in the way that it's like very stereotypically scripted. So this becomes, I think that there is a level to which we can kind of brush it aside between the car races and the absurdity and whatever. But then you watch Hobbs and Shaw, and it is absolutely impossible to ignore because the entire tension between Hobbs and Shaw is, well, my masculinity is better than your masculinity. And I'm going to tear you down through challenging your masculinity, which is inherently homophobic. And it is just the way it comes out. And so because that is their entire existence and their entire relationship to each other, that's the whole fucking movie. There's nothing else between them. And it's exhausting. Like, it's just truly exhausting. The only good thing about that movie is the fucking Transformer motorcycle. That thing that like changes and then folds sideways is fucking great. But yeah, like I think that that's a real struggle with the Fast and the Furious franchise. Like it's devoid. It's just a fun romp, but it like is that okay? I don't know. It's like John Wick is aesthetically amazing. Like it is such a fun world to be in. The choreography, like I go back and I just watch scenes of the choreography that I like remember and want to, whatever. But it is like extremely aggressively violent. And the fact that we are seduced by that and that we think that that's like cool, is that okay? I don't fucking know. If it's the dominant thing that we're engaging with and that we're seduced by around masculinity, like that becomes a problem, right? So I don't know. I'm conflicted about how we engage with these franchises without saying that they shouldn't exist or that we can't enjoy them,
Yeah. Well, and I think that we touched a little bit on it with Alpha Machos, but like or Sylvester Stallone, like when the featured actor is also like creatively responsible or has a lot of like producerial say, I think that also like skews a lot of these out of like being able to analyze them. Like it makes it increases the challenge of trying to like analyze them as media critics, because you can't watch Top Gun Maverick without like thinking about Tom Cruise as a human being. You can't really figure out what the Fast and the Furious could have been if not for Vin Diesel's involvement behind the scenes. And so much of it is kind of like, yeah, I bet that there could have been conversations with like, so these Brazilian guys always speak Portuguese, everyone else speaks English, but like these guys never learned it. Is that what happened? Like, is that a comment because they're from the favela? Like, these two black men are like the only, like these two like black, not like ethnically ambiguous men are the ones who can be like, I bet I can get her number and you can't. Like very schoolyard. But that can't happen because it's like, it just exists in like, this is Vin Diesel's world and we're just living in it.
And I want to believe that there is a world where you can make a fucking ridiculous, goofy, absurd franchise like Fast and the Furious and just not have that shit in it.
Right.
You know, like I want to believe that it's not the cost of having something so insane, you know?
Debs. Oh man. I think there was only one more thing, which is, I feel like you've all been accompanying me on my female mental breakdown, which has been recorded every episode. But we talked about Machos on the Verge. And I think this, like, similarly to straight actors playing queer, like, this is just such a gendered thing where it's like every one of these violent men is like, has like pathological mental health crisis that we're witnessing unfold. And we're just like, wow, what a hero. Whereas like, that's just not a grace that we give to female characters. But yeah, like that was interesting, even thinking about what were we going to talk about for Machos on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown? Because like you could pathologize every single one of these like action movies and say,
oh, 100%.
Like, here's the trauma that we need to unpack.
You're suffering from a terminal case of being gay. Because every action movie we watched. Like,
yeah.
And it's incurable.
The show.
Yeah, I watched Oldboy for the first time like a couple months ago because like it's such a everyone fucking talks about this movie and I was like, I guess I'll watch it, and I was like, what the fuck? Like it's like really, it's extremely intense.
It's hardcore.
And like I don't know, I think I struggle sometimes with like there's a certain degree of like, can I appreciate what everyone else appreciates about this while I'm fucking losing my mind watching this thing,
Yeah.
Where it's like, it's hard to watch. And, I think because at this point in film, like our film history, the twists and turns are not as exciting because we've seen it a bunch of times since then, right? It's like when you go back to the origin, it's a different story, but because we've seen the same fucking trope a million times. So like the big twist at the end, you're just like, oh, like you're like, oh, this is gross. And like, and
it's
like
still effective.
Yeah. And I was like, it was effective, but I also was like, but also why? Like I was like, is this not appropriate? But I was like, why are you doing this? Right. Which might have to do with because we've seen more things kind of do that, but it might also just be like, I'm a little bit tired of the way women are treated in film, like.
And I do feel like in that instance,
it's shock
I'm a
value.
big fan of that director. Sorry. Yes, it really is just like, let's kind of
it's like, are you making okay, great, this we got here. Are you making a point? Like, do you have something to say, or do you just want to shock us? And when I feel like you're just trying to shock us,
torture.
I get frustrated. And I'm not saying that this movie is doing one or the other. I don't really, I don't think I can speak to that. But I think that that's when I get frustrated of like, what is your fucking point? So in the Brooke Shields documentary, the director of Pretty Baby refuses to talk about. And I've only seen the press that is included in the documentary. I have watched Pretty Baby, which is extremely hard to watch. And it's about a child sex worker, an underage child sex worker. And it shows child nudity. Like, it's very explicit in what it's doing. And they're like, it's art
Wow.
and it's tasteful and da-da-da. And I'm like, okay, but it's still fucking hard to watch, you know? And the director refuses to be like, I made the movie. I don't need to comment on the movie as well. You can see what I did.
Yeah.
And so there's a little bit of like, well, yes, let the audience take what they want to take. And like, we can all analyze things and take what we need from them at different points in our life. But there's also a little bit of like, yeah, and this is also really fucking intense, and maybe give us a little bit of insight into like your purpose, or like, does the film, like the ambiguity of the film, I don't know. I don't think lends itself to value plus in society, you know, if you're not actually like making a fucking point.
For sure.
So
I feel
don't
that.
know. That's my high horse.
It's interesting to ask that question of a lot of these topics, which is like, are you doing this for shock value versus like, are you doing this because it makes the movie better or like advances the story? It doesn't have to advance the story, but I think like, for example, like a great sex scene doesn't have to advance the story, but it can advance how we understand the characters, or like it can be an aesthetic benefit or bonus to the movie. But like that question, I think we've probably all seen movies with sex scenes that just was like, this is just gratuitous. Like, it's not
Top Gun Maverick. Quote unquote sex scene, by the way. But like, yeah, no, truly, that's like, it's like, okay.
right. And like,
thanks.
you know, when Vin Diesel like catches a car flying through the air, it's like, oh, are you trying to shock me? Like, it worked because that was awesome, I guess, you know, like, but I think you could ask that about like violence. You could ask that about sex. You could ask that about like Twisted, you know, like From the Twisted Mind of Park Chan-wook. Like, you know, it's, I think it's almost like that pornography question, like, you know it when you see it, of like, there are, so like the Handmaiden, is that the same filmmaker?
Yep.
Like, I thought some of the sex scenes in that were unnecessary, but that they were the point of the movie. And so
I think
you
so
know what
too.
I mean?
I could talk about that movie.
Like,
yeah, for sure.
I was like,
he's wacky with it.
yeah,
you know?
it was like, you're getting wacky with this.
Okay, I don't know why this particular conversation made me think of this, but Jeff Goldblum.
Go on.
Okay, this is such a fucking leap. I was thinking about how like you're talking about character development and how you can use certain things for character development, and how I find the movies that are just plot kind of boring, but it's also why the Fast and the Furious and John Wick and those movies, they're all plot, right? But like very loosely held together plot with like scenes, you know?
Yeah.
So then I went to The Fly and Cronenberg. I don't know why, but I feel like Cronenberg has a point in his films. You know, in a way, like they are shocking, but there's a fucking point that he's like, it's clear that he's trying to get this across, whether you agree, don't agree, whatever. And I value that. I value that a lot. And so then I just went to The Fly, and then I was like, oh, Jeff Goldblum. He's someone who is like in pop culture for years. He himself is fucking weird. Like his masculinity is a little more complex, I think, in relation to how you're breaking down machos. Anyways, I don't think we need to waste time with it. It just came up because I was thinking of Cronenberg.
Well, I will say I love Cronenberg. I feel that makes a ton of sense to me. And I do feel that way about, again, James Spader and Crash. You know what I mean? Like, he's a fucking weirdo. And there's so much gratuitous sex and violence in that. But it's making such a point about sex in the body and whatever.
Yeah, like have something to fucking say.
Yeah,
you know?
I find James Spader hard to categorize
Anita,
too. Weird.
Please write a book about Canadian sexuality.
Oh my God.
I feel like there is something about Cronenberg, and like there's something.
And his son.
Also,
oh my God.
think...
Don't even get that movie. Dude, just go to therapy, man. That movie was fully like, I've got daddy issues and need to go to therapy.
Yeah.
Yeah. How many of these movies could have been avoided by something? What's the meme? It's like men will literally make a whole ass movie instead of going to therapy.
Yeah.
Oh my God, that would be a great podcast.
I love that.
Perhaps a future season of Feminist Frequency.
Yeah.
I think that this has been so much fun because obviously, like, especially since the format of this season was just AC and I kind of like sharing with each other, we chose to kind of each bring something to the episode that like maybe the other had watched. But I think having this conversation about like my perspective is going to evolve on like all of these. Like there are so many of these where it's like the way I felt about it when I was, it's impossible to like divorce Dirty Dancing from like the person I was when I was 10 years old and watching that movie possibly for the first time out of a zillion. But like how it just changes as we change and as like society changes. And when you start to watch something and think like, wow, am I ever going to watch this and think, can you believe it used to be like that? It's like, who knows? But I'm so glad that we got to go back and look at all with you.
It makes me think of Walter Chaw's point around like movies biologically imprint on us, and how over time we change, so our ways that we engage with films change, and things will hit us in different ways. Than
the plot of existence.
Fuck. And I think that's really important to remember as we're going through. Like, I was a huge Buffy fan, and I watched that show a million times. And one of my viewings years later, there was an entire plot point that I saw completely differently because I was at a different point in my life, and I was like, "Holy fuck! It wasn't this; it was this whole time," And I don't know,
Angel.
Neither. It was fucking what's his face, the military guy. It was when it was the scene at, I think, the end of season 4 where Buffy leaves him and Xander gives her this huge fucking lecture about her behavior and all this stuff. And like I read it one way, and then like years later I read it a completely different way, completely different. And I think that's valuable to hold on to, especially as people who speak about media publicly. Like our impressions change and our takes on things change, and like we, based on our experiences in our lives and the people that we talk to and engage with, right? Like having a podcast with Ebony and Carolyn for years, like really changed and the way that I think about stuff. And Kat, when you came on, you brought a whole new perspective that makes me think about things differently. Like last night, Kat sent me this long voice memo that was so fucking smart. And I was like, wow, yeah. I was like, yeah, I didn't think about that. That's great. And I value that. And I also want to hold grace for all of us as we also change and grow in terms of how we look at things,
Yeah, you're going to text me about Pretty Baby while I'm driving, then I'm going to send you a voice memo in response.
I loved it. Yeah.
That has been our bonus episode for this season of Machos Fully Loaded. Thank you, listeners, for joining us on this journey through testosterone.
Wow, the A.C. Lamberty story. Wait. Speaking of, that's me.
I didn't ever get to do a strap in and strap on. Did I do it backwards?
No, you got it.
Oh, that
perfect.
was it. Yes.
No,
I loved it. That was the best part of every episode. I mean, it wasn't. That's so mean. That sounds so awful.
No,
I enjoyed it.
We'll take it.
I was worried we were going to get like a cease and desist. Like, please stop using Feminist Frequency Radio to say strap in and strap on.
It's our new tagline.
Your hosts aren't funny.
When you said strap in and strap on, your tap shoes. Oh, that got
so
me.
Good.
It got me.
Damn. Well, I have been A.C. Lamberty. You can follow me on Instagram and Letterboxd at A.C. Lamberty, and check out that final Letterboxd Macho syllabus, baby.
I'm Kat Spada. I guess I'm going to do some plugs since this is the wrap up on this season. I'm on Twitter at @cat_EX_machina, and I have a sort of in hibernation podcast about Beverly Hills 90210, which, if you like that show or the 90s, it definitely is an exploration of like something I watched when I was 6 and then watched again when I was 16 and then watched again when I was 26 and like going through it and having very different relationships to the characters. And I'm behind the scenes on a new podcast that's coming out this month called Remember the Memories. It is a Clone High podcast because that show is coming back to HBO Max. So that show will be coming up soon. And follow Feminist Frequency on social media at FemFreak. Anita, thank you so much for coming and being amazing today. What do you want to tell people?
I don't know. I'm so excited to be back. I missed you all so much. I loved listening to this podcast. So thank you so much for doing it. Y'all can follow me on my social medias. It's at Anita Sarkeesian on Twitter and Instagram. We are in the middle of a campaign, which I'm sure you heard as you were listening to this episode. So if you want to help support Feminist Frequency and the Games Hotline and all the work we do, please pitch in a couple of dollars. Other than that, stay tuned for whatever the fuck we do next.
If you like the show, help other people find it by subscribing, rating, and commenting on your fave podcast app.
Thanks so much for listening. Woo!
Bye.
Bye.
Oh, we did it.